1. Conceptual writing is allegorical writing. 1a. The standard features of all allegory include extended metaphor, personification, parallel meanings, and narrative. Simple allegories use simple parallelisms, complex ones more profound. Other meanings exist in the allegorical pretext, the cultural conditions within which the allegory is created. Allegorical writing is a writing of its time, saying slant what cannot be said directly, usually because of overtly repressive political regimes or the sacred nature of the message. In this sense, the allegory is dependent on its reader for the completion, though it usually has a transparent or literal surface. Allegory typically depends heavily on figural or image language. Angus Fletcher's book Allegory: The Theory of a Symbolic Mode argues that this heightened sense of the visual results in stasis. Walter Benjamin, Paul de Man, and Stephen Barney identified allegory's reification of words and concepts, words having been given additional ontological heft as things. In allegory, the author-artist uses the full array of possibilities found and created to collage a world that parallels the new production, collectively, of objects as commodity. Words are objects. Note that allegory differs from symbolism in that symbolism derives from an idea, while allegory builds to an idea. Images coagulate around the idea/symbol. Images are jettisoned from the allegorical notion. The work of the work is to create a narrative mediation between image or figure and meaning. Goethe felt this meant allegorical writing was fundamentally utilitarian, and therefore more prose, symbolism being more poetry in its true nature. Note the potential for excess in allegory. Note the premise of failure, of unutterability, of exhaustion before one's begun. Allegorical writing is necessarily inconsistent, containing elaborations, recursions, submetaphors, fictive concepts, projections, and guisings that combine and recombine both to create the allegorical whole and to discursively threaten this wholeness. In this sense, allegory implicates Gödel's first incompleteness theorem. If it is consistent, it is incomplete. If complete, inconsistent. All conceptual writing is allegorical writing. 2. Note that pretextual associations assume post-textual understandings. Note that narrative may mean a story told by the allegorical writing itself, or a story pre- or post-textually about the writing itself or writing itself. 2a. Conceptual writing mediates between the written object, which may or may not be a text, and the meaning of the object by framing the writing as a figural object to be narrated. Narrativity, like pleasure, is subjective in the predicate and objective in the execution, i.e., subject matter. In this way, conceptual writing creates an object that creates its own disobjectification. 2b. In allegorical writing, including both conceptual writing and appropriation, prosody shuttles between the micro-attention to language and macro strategies of language, e.g., the use of source materials in reframing or mixing. The primary focus moves from production to post-production. This may involve a shift from the material of production to the mode of production, or the production of a mode. If the Baroque is one end of the conceptual spectrum and pure appropriation the other, with the impure or hybrid form in between, this emphasis can be gridded. Pure appropriation plus mode plus post. Hybrid impure, mode, material, and post. Baroque, material and post. 2c. Note: the allegorical nature of conceptual writing is further complicated and complected, given that in much allegorical writing the written word tends towards visual images, creating written images or objects, while in some highly mimetic, i.e., highly replicative, conceptual writings, the written word is the visual image. Note: there is no aesthetic or ethical distinction between word and image. 2d. Sophocles wanted a true language in which things were ontologically nominal. This is true in fiction and history. Fiction meaning poetry, poetry meaning fiction. No, sorry. Poetry meaning history. History meaning the future state of having been. This is the job of Gertrude Stein's The Making of Americans. 2e. In his essay Subversive Science, Hal Foster remarks that the appropriation artist, visual, is a, quote, a manipulator of signs, more than a producer of art objects, and the viewer an active reader of messages rather than a passive contemplator of the aesthetic or consumer of the spectacle, end quote. Note that more than and rather than betray a belief in the segregation or possible segregation of these concepts. Conceptualism understands they are hinged. Note that in post-conceptual work, there's no distinction between manipulation and production, object and sign, contemplation and consumption. Interactivity has been proved as potentially banal as a Disney cruise, active as a Pavlovian dinner bell. 2f. The allegorical aspect of conceptualism serves to solder and wedge the gap between object and concept, keeping it open and closed. 2g. In this sense, conceptualism enacts Gödel's theorem. The degree of constancy/completeness of the subject and matter is modulated by the degree to which the linguistic object image is limited/unlimited in nature. This mandates the defining of the set. This invokes the one that is nothing and the being that is multiple, posited by Ellen Badiou. Metaphysic concepts equals possible modes of aesthetic apprehension rather than actual ethical observations. In other words, just as Leibniz is useful for judging the quality of any fictitious universe, the precepts noted here are handy for contemplating other verses, poly, multi, and re. Note Lacan's The Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis. The self is an imaginary construct made of parts of one like another, so to be recognized as one by another, thus made contingent. Mimicry/mimesis being the means by which the subject makes the imaged self. Contingency/multiplicity is therefore the one true nature of universality. Consider the retyping of a random issue of the New York Times as an act of radical mimesis, an act of monastic fidelity to the word as flesh. Consider the retyping of the September 11, 2001 edition, a day that would not be, as an act of radical mimicry, an act of monastic fidelity to words as flesh. If these gestures are both critiques of the leveling and loading medium of media, their combined critique is inseparable from the replication of the error under critique. Replication is a sign of desire. Radical mimesis is original sin. Allegorical writing, particularly in the form of appropriated conceptual writing, does not aim to critique the culture industry from afar, but to mirror it directly. To do so, it uses the materials of the culture industry directly. This is akin to how ready-made artworks critique high culture and obliterate the museum-made boundary between art and life. The critique is in the reframing. The critique of the critique is in the echoing. Note the desire to begin again. 3a. Wystan Kurnau's paper presented at the Conceptual Writing Conference held at the University of Arizona Poetry Center 2008, while not identifying conceptual writing as allegorical as such, suggests that conceptual writing could be classified as pre- or post-textual, or a hybrid. Pretextual writing assumes a pretext, an extant idea, the constraint/procedure, the strategic generality of the technique, such as appropriation or documentation. The post-text is a document necessarily created by the pretext, though post-text may also refer to a primary text used in a hybrid as a secondary text. Regardless of its textual compositions, Kurnau notes that conceptual writing invites its own performativity, a performativity that often crosses genres and media, and is an attempt to disembed the meaning in the contingent and the contextual. 3b. The distinction here is between post-texts that are illustrations of their pretexts, texts that are open, the idea is paramount/paradigm, and post-texts that are proofs, texts that are closed, the idea is exhausted in its execution. There are endpoints to any spectrum and infinite points between them. How one defines the endpoints and the points in between instructs how one defines conceptual writing. In hybrid or impure conceptualism or post-conceptualist writing, the points in between can accommodate a rebellion against or critique of the more stringent endpoints. This has been articulated in post-conceptualist visual art. What is an impure conceptualism or post-conceptualism in writing? A post-conceptualist might invite more interventionist editing of appropriated source material and more direct treatment of the self in relation to the object, as in post-conceptual visual art where the self re-emerges, albeit alienated or distorted. See Paul McCarthy. Adding on to, and/or editing the source material is more a strategy of post-conceptualism, so is reneging on the faithful execution of the initial concept. The most impure conceptualism may manifest in a symptomatic textual excess/extravagance, such as in the Baroque. Do these broken promises point to a failure in the conceptual writing text? Failure is the goal of conceptual writing. In Sentences of Conceptual Art, Sol Levitt writes, "If the artist changes his mind midway through the execution of the piece, he compromises the result and repeats past results. I have failed miserably, over and over again." 4. If allegory assumes context, conceptual writing assumes all context. This may be in the form of an open invitation, such as Dworkin's Parse, or a closed index, such as Goldsmith's Day, or a Baroque articulation, such as Places Dies. Thus, unlike traditional allegorical writing, conceptual writing must be capable of including unintended pre- or post-textual associations. This abrogates allegory's false simulation of mastery, while remaining faithful to allegory's profound interruption of correspondences. Allegory breaks mimesis via its consolatory features, what scattershot this is. Conceptualism's mimesis absorbs what Benjamin called the adorable detail. 4a. The degree of adorable detail in conceptual writing may calibrate to the writing's overt allegorical status. 5. Benjamin Buchloz points out in Allegorical Procedures, Appropriation and Montage in Contemporary Art that 1920s montage work is inherently allegorical in its, quote, methods of confiscation, superimposition, and fragmentation, end quote. More, quote, the allegorical mind sides with the object and protests against its devaluation to the status of a commodity by devaluing it for the second time in allegorical practice, end quote. Buchloh, here via Benjamin, is recasting allegorical strategies through a Marxist lens in a culture where objects are already devalued by their commodification. An allegorical relationship to the art object or text further highlights the process of devaluation. One might argue that devaluation is now traditional/canonical aim of contemporary art. Thus, there is now great value in devaluation. Adorno and Horkheim quote, culture is a paradoxical commodity, so completely is it subject to the law of exchange that it is no longer exchanged. It is so blindly consumed in use that it can no longer be used. End quote. The culture industry, enlightenment as mass deception. Conceptual writing proposes two endpoint responses to this paradox by way of radical mimesis: pure conceptualism and the Baroque. Pure conceptualism negates the need for reading in the traditional textual sense. One does not need to read the work as much as think about the idea of the work. In this sense, pure conceptualism's ready-made properties capitulate to and mirror the easy consumption/generation of text and the devaluation of reading in the larger culture. Impure conceptualism, manifest in the extreme by the Baroque, exaggerates reading in the traditional textual sense. In this sense, its excessive textual properties refuse, and are defeated by, the easy consumption/generation of text and the rejection of reading in the larger culture. Note: these are strategies of failure. Note: failure in this sense acts as an assassination of mastery. Note: failure in this sense serves to interrupt the work, violating it from within. Note: this invites the reader to redress failure, hallucinate repair. 5b. Quote, allegorical imagery is appropriated imagery. The allegorist does not invent images but confiscates them. End quote. Craig Owen, The Allegorical Impulse, toward a theory of postmodernism, beyond recognition, representation, power, and culture. One might argue that confiscation suggests capturing or repenning. Reiteration or recognition seems more apt, as the work is reinvented via its adoption. 5c. In The Origin of German Tragic Drama, Benjamin identified the skull as the supreme allegorical image because it, quote, gives rise to not only the enigmatic question of the nature of human existence as such, but also to the biographical historicity of the individual. This is the heart of the allegorical way of seeing. End quote. The skull is the heart. The same may be said for the image of an iPod. 5d. Craig Owen's article on female appropriation art of the 1980s. Quote, the discourse of others, feminists and postmodernists, end quote, points out that Buchloh's article on allegory missed the crucial gender fact that these artists are all women, and that, quote, where women are concerned, similar techniques have very different meanings, end quote. Stephen Heath, quote, any discourse which fails to take account of the problem of sexual difference in its own enunciation and address will be, within a patriarchal order, precisely indifferent, a reflection of male domination. End quote. Note that the absence of mastery is old hat for females and others. Christine Bucci Glucksmann, quote, this discourse through the other is also discourse of the other, End quote. Again, Badiou speaks of the singularity of the void and the multiplicity of being. The only single entity that exists is the entity of not being. But is the absence of mastery irrelevant to the presence of slavery? The answer may depend on in whose image the slave is made. Note that the woman has been the likeness of a likeness. Note the fidelity problem or the failure of fidelity. 5e. Radical mimesis is radical artifice. There is nothing so artificial as an absolutely faithful realism. See Courbet, see James H., see Goldsmith's Day. See the story of women, inconstant as a mirror. See Mary Kelly, postpartum document. See Irene Moore, a sheep's vigil by a fervent person. 6. Note the allegorical difference between appropriation techniques that elevate the banal, such as Richard Prince's appropriation of Marlboro ads, blowing them up and turning them into art photos, and works that level the elevated, such as Sherry Levine's re-photographing of Walker Evans' photos. Note the similarities between Kenneth Goldsmith's appropriation triptych Traffic, the Weather, and Sports, and Jan Bervin's Nets, a book of poems that perform erasure on Shakespeare's sonnet. Goldsmith adds the artist/author to the ready-made quotidian, upping its art quotient. Bervin subtracts the master from his masterpiece, author from authority. Note: Goldsmith's replication are Duchampian in that the quote, narrative of process establishes a primary meaning, an ultimate originating referent that cuts off the interpretive chain. End quote. Eva Lambois on Robert Ryman, as quoted by Buchloh. Note: Bervin's gesture is more like Rauschenberg's erasure of de Kooning's paintings in leaving the presence of the absence than is like Duchamp's proposed Rembrandt as ironing board. Note to what degree the authorial framing of text as art removes aesthetic control from the reader. Note: to what degree has art removed aesthetics from ethical consideration? 6b1. Note: the regime under which conceptual writing has flowered is the repressive market economy. This is banal observation, nonetheless true. Note that there is no escape from this regime, which will banalize and commodify any mass attempt at subversion, the story of counterculture since the 1960s. In other words, capitalism has a knack for devouring and absorbing everything in its path, including any critique of capitalism. Furthermore, capitalism is naturally a meaningless system. In Violence, Slavoj Žižek writes, quote, the fundamental lesson of globalization is precisely that capitalism can accommodate itself to all civilizations. End quote. Thus, capitalism is a medium. Thus, the medium is the message. 6b2. In conceptual writing, writes Goldsmith, echoing Levitt, quote, what matters is the machine that drives the poem's construction. End quote. Increasingly, for conceptual writers, that machine is now a literal machine. Moreover, as in search engine-based poetry, the process of construction may be another machine. In this sense, both construction and constraint are informed by market needs and consumer inquiries, a procedural loop. 6b3. In Sian Nagai's forthcoming collection of essays, The Cute, the Zany, and the Merely Interesting Three Problems for Aesthetic Theory, one of her definitions of the zany today is the multitasking worker. While Lucille Ball in the I Love Lucille episode Job Switching like Charlie Chaplin in modern times, performs the zany of the assembly line human doomed to frenzied repetition. The overwhelmed actor in a polysemous universe is more like the Marx Brothers version of War in Duck Soup, where Groucho appears in a variety of American uniforms, including those of both sides of the Civil War and the Boy Scouts, or war itself. There is no secure signification, not even the dehumanization of man by and into machine, just the vertiginous effect of too much. A worker who works at home, traditionally a devalued situation, though now often assumed and sometimes commodified as a telecommuting perk, finds the traditional demarcation between work and leisure obscured. Note that this dissolves the standard difference between worker and bourgeois, serving as a perverse fulfillment of the socialist promise that labor, not leisure, will be the source of self-realization. One might argue that, as it turns out, when work is play and play is work, our alienation is complete. Allegorical writing underlines this development and its tensions by drawing attention to the conflation of work, research, and play, composing, particularly as they tend to suggest the same received or hollowed modes of non-production and non-meaning. Production, industrial age, replaced by simulation, information age. Simulation replaced by medium. Zizek has written about the contemporary phenomenon of consumer goods being stripped of their malignant properties: decaffeinated coffee, non-fat cream, internet sex, as a form of constrained hedonism, the puppet and the dwarf, the perverse core of Christianity. To have one's cake and vomit it up. Conceptual writing reinserts the malignancy while reenacting the purge. 6b-4. Note the allegorical imperative in temporal specificity. To make now mandates the adorable detail as both grounding and background. 6b-5. Note that by virtue or device, conceptual writing that needs a narrative frame, like a snail, it must carry its house on its back, elevates the role of the artist/author as first interpreter. Writing scripture is an excellent way to make a church. Writing scripture is an excellent way to make the self a disciple while appearing to be doing something outside the self. Insisting that the gospel and supporting texts have nothing to do with the self is an excellent way for potential believers to think about the self of discipline. This gospel making is very much within the critique and celebration of celebrity. This is very American, particularly since Warhol. This is a story of real faith. 6b-6a. Note that in allegorical practice, the commodity object is revalued as an object via allegorical practice itself. There is restoration at work, and a promise of fetish. 6b-6b. Note that in this way, allegory lies in the allegorical content as well as the allegorical gesture. 6b-6c. NB. These two allegorical axes, gesture/content, do not necessarily work algorithmically, but can and can also work at odds.